Okay, so in this section we're going to be talking about lips, which can be a really difficult feature to draw, and it's kind of weird because they're difficult, but they're also simple in a lot of ways if you follow a lot of the basic principles. One of the more important things that I could say you should know about lips, just as far as their structure goes and drawing them, we have this idea of a stair step happening on the lips. And when I say that, I mean if we're looking at the lips from the front, and we have the center of the lips right here, and then the top of the upper lip comes down to the node. And then we have the bottom lip. Down here. So when we draw the lips, it's not really a straight line. There's this little shape right here that stair steps down, basically just like a little stair. And usually it's angled a little bit. And with many different people, if we look at these reference images, for example, you can see this happening where we go across and then up and then over and then down and then across. This one has a much more smooth transition, but she also does have her mouth open. We could see it here, across, up, over, down, and then we have the bottom lip kind of covering that up. It's very obvious here. This stair step is actually pointed up a little bit, like almost like this. And one reason that you see that happen sometimes is because this stair step is created by the interaction between the node, right? We have these two little, what we call nodes on each side. And this little stair step is created because the top lip goes down and folds underneath itself. And so when that happens, it can sometimes create a more angled effect on this little stair step down. And we're seeing that in this piece of reference. Can look at it here. Again, it's a little bit more subtle here. So if I was going to draw this reference, and maybe we'll draw this one as an example at the end, then I might play up that stair step idea a little bit more. But, you know, and here's another example where we could see, again, this is coming down on the front lip. And so when we draw it, we establish originally this line. But you'll notice in this piece of reference, we've got a little break in that line coming down for that center part of the lip. We can put that in afterwards. So that's really the shape it's created, but when we're drawing it and establishing it, oftentimes we go straight line, and then we add these two little stair steps down onto it. And it's not always an entirely straight line. Something very important to know about lips is that the lips are on what is called the tooth cylinder. And the tooth cylinder you can imagine as just a cylinder that sits right on top of your face, basically, right where your mouth is, and is created by the skeletal structure underneath of the teeth. And so if we're looking at a head from a straight-on view, that tooth cylinder, might as well just establish a little brow line, nose line. That tooth cylinder really sits right here. And what ends up happening is if we have light coming down and hitting this form, then we basically get an effect like this happening. If we have a shadow from the nose, shadow from the brow, and then underneath, then over the chin. But you can see that we're basically shading this form, this whole form, on the side of the face as if it were just a big cylinder, right? Because if light was to hit a cylinder, it would be kind of like this. And if we were to draw that cylinder more in 3 dimensions, it ends up looking more like this, right? And this basically is what your mouth sits on top of. We can maybe even grab this, oops, stretch it out a bit. You know, again, that's basically what we're looking at, and that's more or less what I had there. And so your mouth, when it's sitting on top of this, it follows that curvature. So originally I said we established this straight line, right? Well, it's not entirely true, because that line is really dependent upon the curvature of the perspective of the head and what you're looking at. So if you have that separation of the lip going down for the top lips, you can see that that whole curve is being created because we're looking at this in perspective. As you start to turn more and more into perspective, this stair-step idea is going to go away, because as we turn it and move it through space, we're going to be seeing less of a straight-on view, because what's happening is this is going down and tucking underneath and kind of rolling up into the face, sort of wrapping back up. And you can think of this as almost like a little donut with the node in the center, and we've got all these curved lines, which really are the muscles of the face, that kind of pull in at this point, and the lip happens to be the place where it folds back underneath itself. And so as we start turning in perspective more and changing that, usually you're going to see that straight part disappear. But we can maybe add in a little bit, right? But it's very important to understand that the lips are not going to be straight, and that they're really representative of... This is a pretty weird looking thing that I'm drawing here. I think lips are one of the weirdest features. If you're just going to draw a page of features, ears, a page of ears, page of eyes is pretty common to be seen. A page of noses, but something about lips for some reason is just kind of weird. It's like you expect them to start talking or something, I don't know. So anyway, basically, you know, this is the concept that we're after, right? Depending on the perspective that we choose, let's do one from a below perspective. That mouth is going to follow that perspective, more or less. Perspective is a real key for drawing. Having basic knowledge of 1-point, 2-point, and 3-point perspective is really helpful. And just being able to draw 3D shapes more or less accurately from your head is really, really important. because it really helps a lot. And if you basically think about everything you draw in perspective, it's a much more critical thinking approach when it comes to drawing. And what I mean by that is you really have to think about all the moves you're making. Say, does that feel like it's falling in the right perspective? Does that feel like it's a part of the correct scene? So here we are. This curve of the mouth, this is like the center of the lips, is following this top curve of this little cylinder. And so if we were going to draw lips on that, the lips would obviously protrude off. Now the bottom lip isn't always completely round like this either. On some people it is. But a lot of times you'll see that the bottom lip actually has this opposite kind of curve happening like this. It's kind of like a very classically attractive thing, is to see this like anti-curve right here. And that's created because lips are comprised of what I like to call pillows. So we have little, basically pillows of fat deposits, and probably muscle too. I have to be frank that I actually don't know if it's entirely just fat or muscle, probably a combination of both if I had to guess. But we have these sections that the lips are made up of. And the bottom one is made up by these two. And this curve happens because of just the structure and the form of this, and really a lack of having an extra one in the middle. Right? We get this curve stretching between the two. So there's 3 on the top and 2 on the bottom. And so we're going to get this curve happening. A lot of times. And oftentimes with lips, we're also going to see an overlap of the primary top part. This part comes and overlaps in front of those other two. So these other two, the top two, tuck in behind this central one. So oftentimes you're going to see very prominently that that front piece is going to overlap and create a hard line against those other two. Or, I'm sorry, against, you know, this far one. A lot of times when you're drawing lips as well, you can get away with just putting a little bit of a darker spot in the middle of the lips, and that sort of acts like, we'll talk about that when we get into the more rendered part, but that sort of acts like the mouth is open, and that there's kind of some, it implies some motion happening there. That's something that you want to try to strive for if you're going to be drawing lips or a mouth or something like that, is to strive for this idea that the lips are in motion and in movement, and that where you had just stopped to draw them was, you know, right as they were in between words or something like that. So you want to try to draw the mouth like it is in motion. It's just, it helps a lot with the aesthetics. It's sort of an abstract concept, but it really does help. and I hope some of my examples of the newsprint drawings that I have actually show that concept pretty well. So from this bottom perspective, we are going to see this curve down into that node usually, and then back up. A lot of times the top lip falls into shadow. And the bottom lip stays more in the light, and then we get a shadow happening right beneath the bottom lip in an area called the mentolabial sulcus, which the name really doesn't matter that much at all. It's just, you know, it's the name. These nodes generally you want to keep a bit softer, but where it folds right back underneath, you can actually make kind of a crisper hard. And then you also get a crisp hard right underneath it on this side as well. So the lips are really a place where you have a lot of edge variety happening. They're really fun to draw in my opinion. They've caused me a lot of trouble for a while, but once I started to learn some of the main tips, I would say, for drawing them, is when I felt things really started to open up for me, and it became a lot easier. And what I mean by, you know, these tips are keeping your edges softer. Keep this part soft, keep the node soft, keep that soft on the mentolabial sulcus as it wraps around to the cheek. Usually we have some tone on the bottom lip as well, just because the bottom lip is, you know, the lips usually have color to them, kind of like a pinky red sort of thing, especially if somebody's wearing lipstick, it's even more so. But, you know, the lips are not these hard lines around, you know, like that might look good for like a cartoon style or something like that. But if you draw every little detail of the lips in like a hard line fashion like this, it's just not going to look very good most of the time. But again, if you're drawing like a cartoony style or something like this, it's hard for me to draw it bad, I feel like. But, you know, a lot of times people make the mistake of doing like this kind of thing. They're drawing lips and it just gets like very flat. But this is not what we want to do, because what you end up doing when you do this kind of thing is you're starting to draw what we'd call iconography. It's like the icon of something, right? Like if you were going to draw an icon of an eye, you draw this, right? But remember in our video about eyes, all the stuff we went over to, you know, get away from this kind of thing, the three-dimensional forms, all that kind of stuff. So this is why things like perspective and ideas of drawing cylinders and, you know, things in perspective and then wrapping lines around them, that's why this is all really important, is because you can move from something like this to something like this just by, you know, baseline understanding general perspective and edges and things like that. But as I was saying here with the bottom lip, a lot of times we get a little bit of color, so like pinky kind of color on the bottom lip, and a lot of times that color will start off hard along the edge, and then it will become much softer as it approaches the lip. A good tip that I learned was that you should, for the bottom lip specifically, you should really try to focus on the form underneath it first, and then only once you really have established the form, then you can put the color on top. Obviously, if you're painting in oils, then that's not really the case because you sort of have to put the color in there. But if you're painting digitally, for example, you just really want to focus on, get that form to read first. Those pillows, which we can apply a little tone right down the middle for that to imply this, where they're sort of connecting up together. And just making sure that we get those edges really soft. But the underlying form is what's important for the lower lip. The color that's on it is really almost secondary in a way. So keep your edges soft and keep them really well contained, and try to contain your shapes just like everything. Keep your edges soft and look for those points of hard edges where the nodes are coming up and folding back into each other again, because you're getting a form that kind of like, remember that donut idea? You're getting a form like this that's happening, more or less. This would be a little bit different. Everything's going back and wrapping up into that point, right? And then it's wrapping over itself. And then we have the philtrum, obviously, which is, it's pretty easy to draw, in my opinion. It's not really too hard. You just kind of basically smear some tone on there, and then you generally have one side that's going to be softer, which is going to be where the philtral ridge, is it? Yeah, philtral ridge is, and then a hard edge more so on the inside as it softens out a little bit to get to there, to the lower part. So again, we're sort of talking about this in the scheme of painting, and I think talking about too much about stylization and stuff is maybe a little bit outside of the range of this video. I want to try to make this one a little bit shorter because the last two have been over an hour long, and that is a little bit long. I think just some quick tips are really what I'm after. And then usually with the lips you can get away with quite a few specular highlights and stuff because of they're usually kind of wet, similar to the eye. So you can get away with some nice crisp highlights, which usually look pretty good and are pretty fun. So with that, let's quickly go and draw some. Which ones did we say we were going to draw? I totally cannot remember. I think these ones? Maybe? Yeah, we can go for these ones, number 10. Oops. Okay. Dang, okay, here we go. So normally when I draw them, again, the same process if I'm doing digital or drawing traditionally. I'm usually going to start out by trying to identify the big curves of it, similar to how I draw an eye. Start drawing an eye. Something kind of like that, and then we have the stair step idea. Go across. You want to make sure that you get that stair step consistent on the other side. In other words, I don't want to make my lip stop down here because that's way lower than the other side. Right? They're pretty much even with each other. Very important to identify that little overlap. of the central piece. More of a subtle node on this person. But we can just start by scumbling in a little bit of tone. If I was drawing a lot of times, I would just go ahead and put in a little ellipse there. Maybe we can straighten that out slightly. Okay, and then we have the what is generally called the Cupid's bow for the lips, which is, you know, if you just picture like a bow and arrow, that whole top lip is basically making a bow shape. Like if we just erase this bottom one, and then rotate this, we basically got a bow and arrow, right? So sometimes you'll hear the upper lip referred to as like the Cupid's bow for that reason. And just generally, real quick about placement, the lips usually fall if we have on a basic head, and this is a little bit of a lame head, but you know, I'm really just doing this to quickly explain the concept. Try to get this a little more accurate. So we have like a head here. As far as placement goes, the lips usually fall, if this is our brow line, our nose line, our chin, our hairline, the lips usually fall about halfway in between the chin and the nose. That's kind of like the center of the lips, but typically I find it's maybe a little bit higher than halfway, because you have to make sure that if this is the bottom of the nose, then you have to give a little bit of room for the philtrum, and then you have the lips themselves, which end up right there. Typically for female, if you're drawing characters or something like that, for female characters, to make it appear a little bit more feminine, play down the chin, as in make the whole chin and jaw just rounder, smoother, and smaller, and then push the mouth up towards the nose a little bit more. I can talk about that a little bit more in depth maybe if I'm doing a head drawing class or something, but you know, because then you start really talking about the differences in proportion from females to males, and that kind of turns into a different thing. But just as a quick tip, generally you want to push that mouth a little bit higher, but you don't want it to be so high that it starts looking awkward and weird, right? Like, you know, it's kind of strange, as well as too low is pretty strange as well. If we have somebody who, but all these things are acceptable within, again, if you're doing character concepting or something like that, then your character could look like that. This guy's guy or girl or whatever looks more like a guy to me, I guess, but they're very questioning. So be careful when you're putting your mouths on that you don't do them too low, you don't do them too high, and it's somewhere about half or a little bit higher than half, not too low. Okay, back to this real quick. What time do we got? About half an hour? Okay, cool. A little bit of a tone for the Philtrum. The Asaro head is another really great tool for breaking down the structure here, because what's happening is we go coming down the cheek, up before we get to the top of the lip, and then we come down, in, out, and usually there's a little secondary out that happens right there. You can kind of see it like in this area right here. It's usually pretty subtle. Maybe a little bit even more subtle than what I have. It's more pronounced on some people, honestly. Kind of just goes with like the fullness of the lips. And then we go back down in. Maybe not that extreme. We go back down in, and then around that mental sulcus, and then around the chin. So there's kind of like a hollow that's happening right here. Obviously, if you put your finger right there on your own face, then you can sort of feel that. Just going to kind of squint my eyes down, do some quick mapping. When I'm working digitally a lot of times, or just like painting, I usually don't do like straight up mapping. Most of the time I just kind of start blocking in my shadows. But, you know, we can do a little bit of that here. It's not going to hurt us. Because this is more so how I would draw it if I was drawing on newsprint or maybe drawing in my sketchbook or something. But you should also experiment with like drawing these a bunch of different ways. It's really just about like knowing the concept and understand the concept of the thing form coming down here and turning, you know, and how the nodes work, and then how this central part overlaps as well. You know, it's really about knowing that stuff, and then how you draw it really doesn't matter as much, as long as you're drawing it in a way that makes sense to you, and if you have to show it to other people, that it makes sense to other people as well. For example, in my case here, if I'm trying to teach people about some of this stuff, then I kind of have to make sure that I draw it in a very like logical and coherent way. And if you're doing work for clients or something like that, you have to make sure that your sketches and drawings and everything that you're doing is coherent and readable for the client. But, you know, different jobs are going to require different levels of finishes. Like if you're doing more concept type stuff, you can probably get away with a lot less in certain circumstances than if you're doing finished illustration. You know, if you're doing more finished illustration, then you're going to need to make sure that your rendering and your indications and all these things are on point, like really on point. Otherwise, you're not going to be creating believable images, really. So sort of an interesting thing that we have happening here is a lot of times you'll see this too, is a shadow actually being cast on the lip itself from the top and then kind of falling over and curving around that form. So we have the lip connecting, but then we have a little area of shadow in between. Usually what I do is I darken this shadow up quite substantially, which we'll get to when I start adding tone in a moment. Because a lot of times there's reflected light happening. And reflected light, again, is, imagine you have an egg and you're lighting, you set an egg on your kitchen table or a counter, and then you put some light on that. Light shining down this way, you're going to create a shadow right here, right? If you place a piece of white paper underneath the egg, then that light is going to shine off. There would also be a little shadow. But that light is going to shine off that paper and bounce back up into that shadow and create reflected light. A really easy way to see this is if you have a color, you know, you could do it with a white sheet of paper, but if you have a colored sheet of paper, it's really a lot easier because you put the colored sheet of paper underneath the egg, and you'll notice that this whole side of the egg will turn. If you had green paper, for example, it would turn green because all that light is being bounced up and reflected back up into there. So same concept happening here, And so when we get into a little bit of the tone manipulation, you'll see how that works, which we're pretty much ready for at this point. This is just my quick map of what's going on here. Again, remember, we want to keep a lot of these edges softer than we think we need to have them be. Lips are a really good place to practice doing really good soft edges, because a pretty common beginner mistake in drawing is just people don't make their edges soft enough. But with lips, they're really not going to look that good unless you really utilize your soft edges properly. If you're trying to go for a more rendered painterly style, I should say. Okay, so let's go ahead and fill in our shadows. Make sure to squint your eyes down as well at your reference. But this is obviously very similar to if we were going and filling in that middle value number 5 on our drawing. And you can see it's getting a little bit messy, but that's okay, because I can just go ahead. You want to try to shade it. Obviously I can't show you the shading techniques in digital that I would be showing you in traditional, but you'll probably be seeing a demo, so that will be covered. But basically we just want to fill in our big light and dark pattern of what's going on here. Some people I know working with digital really don't like using the blur brush, but in my opinion the blur brush is one of the best tools there, because it really helps you get edges really easily that you can't really get otherwise. As long as you don't overuse it and then you kind of work back into your stuff a little bit, then it usually looks pretty good. Okay, and then softening pass. So let's go ahead and again keep this edge in particular soft. And look at other artists too. Look how other artists are doing this. Because I'm talking about the ways that work for me, but you might see that other artists are doing it differently, and maybe you like how they're doing it. So, you know, you should check out others as well. And don't get all your information just from one place. So if we get back from that and look at it, you know, the value pattern is starting to show pretty nicely, and it seems like it's working. So now I'm going to go ahead and take a little bit of a darker value, start to bring back out some of those points that I had before, but just kind of look at my reference and squint down a little bit more. Probably not going to outline the whole central part here. Like, you know, I'm not going to go all the way straight across the bottom. You probably could, but sometimes it looks a little bit better if you just break up those shapes a little bit, in my opinion. And just kind of slowly working up the value chain. You could see really clearly here, this little dark spot that I'm shading right now, this is being created because of that overlap between the lips. You know, the central piece is overlapping the far pillow. A lot of times you'll also find that it'll be darker at the top here on the far side that's in shadow, and then it will fade down to get lighter, and then we'll have a little bit of that reflected light happening right down there. Okay, let's go a little darker. Just find that node. It should be back there somewhere. Okay, come back here. Usually you'll find the darkest parts of the drawing in lips are in the nodes. So we can probably just go full black in that for the most part. We might bring our values up just slightly because it'll take a little bit longer to bring this to a full rendered finish if I'm going completely full value. And I don't need to go full value to display the concepts. Usually a little bit of reflected light happening inside the node itself, so we have a little core shadow on the outside, a little bit of reflected light on the inside, Okay, coming up, following that line of the lips. Okay, then as I mentioned, we sort of have this secondary shadow that's being created. And usually for that, I do go ahead and fill that in a little bit darker. And again, we can do, if we're following that pillow, that top pillow, you can see it very slightly here, that's very slightly darker, just in a little shape like this right here. Usually I play that up a little bit because I think it looks a little bit better. And again, we oftentimes have a little bit of reflected light happening down in there. Go ahead and take our little blur. Try to finesse a couple of things. Come back here. We can put some tone over this whole section. Be a little more careful. Sharp edge right on this node, and then maybe a little bit in the reference I'm seeing here. It's not really as sharp, so I'm not going to make it as sharp on this particular one. If you squint down, this whole section here really kind of merges together, so we can try to strive to get the same thing. You can see this very subtly on this one, but we actually get some highlights up here. So oftentimes you'll find that you get a bit of a highlight right along this ridge right before it drops down. That's much more pronounced on some other people. Again, it kind of depends on how full the lips are of the person that you're drawing. These ones are kind of like, I'd say these are pretty average, or kind of moderate. Maybe a little bit more on the full side. Some people have really thin lips, some people have very rounded lips as well. And in cases where people have those more rounded lips, a lot of like the Cupid's bow information and stuff, that kind of goes away, and you kind of just end up with a, you know, some straight, or not straight, but some more curvy lips like that, I guess you'd say. More of a singular curve rather than a series of curves. That just sort of happens as the lips get more full. Okay, we can keep this edge pretty soft. Want to keep this the edges along here pretty soft as well. Now you see we have a very slight tone shift on this bottom lip where it's got to be a little bit lighter right here. And a little bit more of that tone of the lips on here. This is where I was kind of trying to get at, especially if you're painting, that you really have to focus on the form of the lips first. I'm going to switch over to a different brush actually. There's a brush I have that I really like using. This one. This one's cool because you put down a stroke and then you can start to blur it afterwards. Usually you have a pretty crisp edge where the chin meets the mendolabial sulcus. And that sulcus kind of goes around the edges of the chin. And we're seeing a little bit here. Sometimes that node extends off the side as well. Like the halftones extend down a little bit as like a lot of the muscles and stuff kind of fold up into that area. And we have a little bit of tone happening. Like I said, the tone for the lower lip is usually a little bit stronger right in the corner here, and then it kind of starts to fade off a little bit. And we've got a lot of like little details and stuff happening on these lips as well. We could probably get away with indicating those just with like some little soft and hard edges. Don't really have to do anything too extreme for those. Usually it doesn't look that good to, like there's one pair of lips on here they're kind of like dry, I guess, these ones. And so you get this happening a lot more. Similar on these ones. Kind of happens if your lips are like chapped and stuff. Happening a little bit here, but again, it's like don't make those little shapes too dark. The values are very subtle, so no need to really overdo it with that, I would say. Again, put in a little bit of reflected light there on that underside of that central pillow. Going with some darker darks. Try to get some good contrast in there. You know, and it doesn't take too long before you really start getting some that looks pretty realistic. But a big part of that is just like your edges and your edge choices and things that you start to make. And you know, you get better at that through time, just lots of practice, trying to render stuff, and then doing master studies, seeing what other people are doing, other artists are doing, and then trying to kind of emulate them the best that you can. But a good place for highlights on the lips, again, right underneath here, where this node is kind of like folding up on top of the lip, can be a decent place. You sometimes will get some, it's not very strong on this individual, but a lot of times on this little secondary ridge that's a little bit lighter usually, that's not really the skin tone of the lip. The lip is really more of like the lower lip specifically. It's a bit more of just like a surface texture than it is really a thing. And so that's why you want to focus on that underlying form first, because it's the form that's important. It's like, you know, putting a surface texture of anything on top of something, like getting like a tree bark kind of texture and putting it on top of a ball, right? Or getting a hard stone or something like that, and hard stone type texture, and you could wrap that same texture around this lip. As long as the form reads properly, it'll still look like a lip, really. So all in all, that's kind of my general tips on lips. I would say, you know, maybe a little bit of a gradient here across. Maybe we'll just quickly do a little multiply layer. something like that. Can easily overdo it with that. So yeah, that's kind of what I would suggest. Hope that helps, and yeah, I'll see you whenever I see you.